Just for your information, this session is being recorded, so we'll send you the recording at a later point, and you can just refer to it. We'll begin by talking about ourselves, introducing ourselves. We would also be talking about how we will be doing expense tracking in Slack. So let me just begin by sharing my screen. Yep. So you should be able to see my screen now. Yeah. So we would be talking about expense filing in Slack. We would be visiting the old approach for expense management. We would then be talking about why to do expenses in Slack. We would be taking a look at ExpenseTron, which is our own in-house product, and it is used for filing expenses, expense management in Slack, and then the major takeaways from the presentation. So let's begin. First up, an introduction about ourselves. So we are Anek. We are a software company that makes people management software suite for Slack, Microsoft Teams, and Google Chat. We have various products, three of them mentioned over here. And you can go ahead and feel free to take a look at any of these products. Today, specifically, since we are talking about expense management, we'd be taking a look at ExpenseTron. So traditionally, the way the expense tracking is done is that you could either do it via Excel templates or web-based applications. A lot of teams that we work with come from either of these two alternatives. You could do it via Excel templates, but the obvious disadvantage over there being that Excel templates are too error prone. And it's quite difficult to apply business logic over there. So for example, if you want to apply approval rules, or if you want to apply budgets or anything of that fashion, it is quite inefficient to manage that over there. The second being web-based applications, and while a lot of firms use a lot of web-based tools, the process remains quite slow, and they're quite cumbersome to use. So for example, everything happens over emails, which means that the process is quite slow. And then as your workforce grows, it can become a little cumbersome to manage. Moving on, there are obvious advantages of doing expense management in Slack. So for teams that are Slack heavy, the whole idea is that you can do the process from within Slack. You don't ever have to leave Slack. And everybody does love Slack because Slack is so efficient and the communication happens in real time. So your expense management also happens in real time over there. Employees can file and approve, managers can approve expenses in real time. As a result, you would see higher adoption among employees. And the obvious fact is that Slack and ExpenseTron both are really easy to use. So you can just use it from a mobile phone or from a desktop app, whatever you want. And they're really, the user interface is really intuitive. So when we delve into a demonstration of ExpenseTron, you'd see how easy it is to file expenses via Slack. We'd be taking a look at some of our customers and their success stories and how they transitioned to ExpenseTron and how was their experience of using the whole product. And, by and large, shifting from a traditional web app or an Excel-based system to the idea of filing expenses on Slack. Smove, which is a car rental company in Singapore, is one of our clients, and we'd be focusing on their success story right here. So Smove was established in 2012. It has somewhere around 60,000 customers, 4.4 million in revenue, and a total of 383 employees. Prior to them using ExpenseTron, they were on an Excel-based system. And as I said, what they were looking for is that a simple tool to file their expenses, which managers can approve, and they can apply various business logic to it. The second thing was that they really wanted the uploading of receipts and the management of receipts to be easy. And the third thing was that they wanted to go ahead and apply some logic regarding multiple approvals. So this is what SMove came in looking for. And as a solution, we offered ExpenseTron to them. So ExpenseTron as a product makes it really easy for you to create expenses and manage them from within Slack. Creating an expense is easy, so let me just take you across for a live demo and show you how expenses are created within ExpenseTron. We'd be looking at both the employee side and the manager side of the uh, product. So you can begin by creating an expense by saying something simple like coffee for $10 at Starbucks yesterday, right? And once you say that to the bot is going to throw up a confirmation message to you. The bot is intelligent enough to categorize the expense. You can also bill it to a payment instrument. The major feature that I'd like to draw your attention to over here is that you can click on upload receipt, and you can upload a receipt over here. All you have to do is that you can just click a picture of the receipt and drag and drop a receipt over here, and the receipt would get uploaded along with the expense, and the manager and the administrator would be able to see it at a later point. Once you confirm this expense would be sent across to the manager, who would then be able to approve the expense from his end, right? They'll get a notification on Slack that the expense has been created by a certain employee, and they'll be able to approve or deny that particular expense. Once they approve or deny a particular expense, it's going to be synced with QuickBooks or Xero. If you use any of those accounting softwares, you obviously have the facility of syncing your QuickBooks or Xero account to ExpenseTron, and once that is done, your expense would automatically be synced to QuickBooks or Xero. Any questions at this point? Okay, sure. I think there are no questions, so we'd move on. So that's how you go about creating expenses on ExpenseTron. And yes, thanks for the question, Suze. Actually, I think you may be muted, so you can unmute yourself and ask the question. Hello, Suze. Yes. So the way ExpenseTron syncs to Xero is that you can just you have a settings over here on the admin panel. You can just connect your account to Xero, and once you connect your account to Xero, there are obvious advantages over there. We export or import all of your categories. So over here you can just click on connect to Xero, and your account would be connected to Xero. It's a one-click integration. Once you're connected with Xero, we would import all of your expense categories, so you wouldn't have to create any categories within ExpenseTron, and your expenses would be automatically synced into your Xero account. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yep. Thanks. Moving on. Yep. Thanks. Uh, Moving on. Let's go back to ExpenseTron. Yep. Once you're done with creation of expenses, you can go ahead and upload receipts as I showed you. You can also go ahead and create expenses in another currency. So for example, a lot of teams that we work with, they always ask us that we spend in multiple currencies. Do you have the facility to create expenses in multiple currencies? So you could just say something like spend $25, 25 CAD on Uber. Right. And what the bot does is that since you're filing your expense in CAD and assuming your primary currency is dollars, you would see the exchange rate calculated over here. And you can go ahead and confirm this expense, and it will be taken across to your manager, who would then go ahead and approve it. Right. You could also create expenses in any other currency. You can have Australian dollars or Singapore dollars as your primary currency, and then you can go ahead and file expenses in other currencies as well. When you're pulling up reports, you'd be able to see both the Canadian dollar value, and you would also be able to see the American dollar value, right? Once you have created an expense in another currency, you can just go ahead and confirm it, and the expense would be created. Whenever you pull up reports, then you'd be able to see that expense. When you're creating mileage expenses, you can just say something very simple to the bot, like drove from New York to Boston for 219 miles, right? And you can fix up a mileage rate within the bot on the admin panel that we'll take a look at. And then the bot will automatically calculate the expense amount based on the miles that you have driven, right? So you can again confirm this expense, and this would go across to your manager, and it will be approved. Any questions related to mileage expenses or creating expenses in another currency? Sure, I'll move on. Uh, Once we have created expenses, then I'd like to show you how ExpenseTron can work as a standalone system, and an integration with accounting softwares. We've spoken about integration with accounting softwares a bit earlier, but I'd like to take you through how we go about integrating accounting softwares and what are the specifics of the integration. So the way the integration works is that you'd be able to integrate to QuickBooks Online and Xero. It's a one-click integration, and should you click on any of these integrations, you'd be able to go ahead and log into your Xero or QuickBooks account, and ExpenseTron would be integrated. Once the integration has happened, we'd be able to import all of the expense categories from Xero. So you don't really need to create categories. Earlier, when we had filed an expense, you'd seen expense categories. So you wouldn't really need to create expense categories. Your expenses would automatically be synced to Xero or QuickBooks as and when that they are approved by your manager. And whenever somebody marks an expense as paid from within Xero or QuickBooks, then the employee is going to receive a notification that the expense has been marked as paid, right? So syncing with an accounting software makes your life really easy. And obviously, I think one added advantage over there is that we don't do any changes to the accounting system as such. The accounting system really remains the same, so accounting teams love us. But then you can go ahead and have the added advantage of a ExpenseTron QuickBooks Xero integration, right? As a standalone system, what ExpenseTron can do is that you can also go about marking expenses as paid from within ExpenseTron. So as a finance manager, what you can do is that you can go ahead onto the admin panel, draw up a report of the unpaid expenses, and you can just go ahead and mark them as paid, and the employee would receive a notification that their expenses have been marked as paid, right? So you have both the options. You can use ExpenseTron as a standalone system and also along with accounting softwares. Are there any questions at this point? Yep, I do see a couple of questions coming up. So, oh no, okay. Uh, Great. So, moving ahead, ExpenseTron also allows you to do much more. So you can have scheduled expenses and reminders. You can also have mileage expenses. You can design your approval hierarchy. Also have some customized fields, and you get stellar customer support. These are all things that we would be taking a look at later on in the tech. So we approach our next section, which is ExpenseTron for admins. So till now, we had been visiting the employee side of ExpenseTron, and now we would be taking a look at what ExpenseTron looks like from a managerial admin point of view, right? Just checking in if there are any questions at this point. Otherwise, we can move ahead. Yeah, I guess there are no questions. Great. So all along we've been talking about creating expense categories. Now I would like to show you how expense categories are created from within ExpenseTron. As an admin or as a manager, you can just say settings to the bot, and the bot is going to share a settings dashboard link with you. Once you click on this link, you would be brought onto the admin panel where you can go ahead and create expense categories for yourself. So expense categories, if you're already synced with Xero, as I had mentioned earlier, you really don't need to go ahead and create expense categories. All of your expense categories would be imported from QuickBooks or Xero. But if you haven't synced ExpenseTron with Xero, then creating a category is really simple. You can type out a category name and hit create. And at a later point, you can disable the category. Once you create a category, you'd be able to see the category in the expense category drop down right here, and then you'll be able to disable a category at a later point should you want that. In a similar fashion, you can go about creating payment methods. The payment methods over here are pretty easy to create. You can type out a payment method and hit create. Once you do that, you can create multiple payment methods. It could be a personal card, it could be a company card. Should you want to bill your expenses to multiple company cards, then you can also create expenses to you can also create payment methods like company card Amex 1234, company card Amex 5234, and we'd start showing that in the payment methods drop down right here. So yep, you see this drop down. So we show all of the payment instruments right here. And while filing an expense, an employee can just select the payment method that the expense has to be billed to, and this expense would be billed to that particular payment method. Any questions on that? Sure. Moving ahead, once we have created payment methods, then you can just go ahead and configure a lot of other settings in ExpenseTron. If you're working with ExpenseTron in the standalone mode, then as I had mentioned before, you can we can import your expense categories, and you can mark your expenses as paid in ExpenseTron. Moving on to the advanced features, expense reporting remains an essential part of any expense tracking system. So ExpenseTron does detailed expense reporting. So for example, if I come to the managerial interface right here, you'd be able to view on the admin panel the reports section, right? So the reports section would show you a bunch of reports. We would show you all of the expenses categorized by their approval statuses, and should you click on a particular expense, you'd be able to view the receipts associated with it, who was the expense approved by, what payment instrument, was it billed to, and various details about this expense. If you've approved an expense, you can also unapprove it from here, or if you've not approved it, then you can go ahead and approve it from here. And you can slice and dice data in a bunch of ways. You can slice and dice data by approval status, by department, by payment method, so on and so forth. You'd also be able to see a report of your pending expenses, all of the expenses that are currently waiting approval. So you can just go ahead and approve it from the admin panel, and then enter a comment and then click on approve, which means that the employee would get a notification on their Slack that the expense has been approved, right? And you can go ahead and approve expenses from this particular report. There are other filters that work on the report as well, by people, by category, by departments. You can filter data whichever way you want, right? Couple of other things that I'd like to take you through are receipt forwarding and custom tags. So receipt forwarding is a feature that we had built for one of our clients called Smove. They are a car rental company, so their employees were always traveling in Singapore and outside. And what they needed was a system to be able to upload and track receipts in a streamlined fashion. So what we created for them was that they could click a picture of their receipt and they could send it across to us, and then we would create that as an expense. So now what you can do is that you can click a photo of your receipts and you can just forward it to an email alias, and we can go about and create an expense for you automatically. So it proved out to be a boon for them, because across the many trips that their employees take and across the millions of expenses that they file, they can just click a photo of their receipt and send it across to us, and that becomes an expense automatically. So it removes the additional step of coming to Slack and then typing out an expense and then creating it. You can just click a photo of the receipt, send it across to us, and voila, the expense is created. Moving on, you can also add some additional fields to a particular expense. So if you want to request information like client, region, department, and several other fields that you want to add on to the expense, you can create custom tags. And over here, you see that you can select region, you can select a client associated with an expense. And that would mean that, all the information, the additional information that you've asked for gets appended onto your request. And once the expense is created and confirmed, you'd be able to see all of those additional information that has been added to the expense, right? Lastly, I'd like to take you through some finance manager functions. So there are essentially three parties that are interested in ExpenseTron. We've talked about the employee, we've talked about the admin. Now we'd be talking about the finance manager. I had earlier talked about using ExpenseTron as a standalone system. So if you're using ExpenseTron as a standalone system, you can just come to the unpaid expenses dashboard, and you can click on a particular expense and then you can mark as paid, which would mean that the employee would get a notification that their expense has been marked as paid. If you've obviously synced your expense tracking with Xero or QuickBooks Online, this process is automatically done, and then you'll be able to mark as paid your expenses from Xero or QuickBooks, and that information would be passed on to ExpenseTron. Finally, I'd like to show you that you can create budgets within ExpenseTron. So you can go ahead and assign budgets to a particular department or a particular employee. And then you can go on and define a budget frequency, if it's a monthly budget or if it's an annual budget, and if the budget renews after a specific duration. So you can define that. As and when expenses are filed according to the budget, according to the category that we've set up the budget for, then the budget gets depleted, and you'd be able to see the remaining budget over here in the remaining budget section. Right. So you could do this for various departments, and you can create this for employees even. So I think at this point, I'm pretty much done with the features of ExpenseTron. Next up, what we'd be visiting are the major takeaways from today's webinar. Are there any questions at this point? Sure. Moving on. So just summing it up for you, the major takeaways from today's webinar are that expense filing over Slack makes it a lot easier for you to go ahead and manage your expenses, and makes the process more seamless. So ExpenseTron as a product can do everything that any of the other expense tracking services does. But we deliver all of these capabilities via Slack, which makes it easier, seamless for both the employees and the administrators to create and manage their expenses. The obvious advantage being that if you're a Slack heavy team, you never ever have to leave Slack. You can go on using Slack and creating expenses from there. So the employees file expenses in real time. Everything happens in real time. The data is more accurate, and there is a higher adoption within the company. So it's a win-win situation for all of us. Uh, the third point being that you could also put in complex business logic and admin capabilities. So if you've got to define, budgets for your team, or if you've got to define various approval logics related to your expenses, you can go ahead and do that. And we don't do any changes to your accounting system. So accounting teams love us. You can just deploy ExpenseTron within your organization and sync it up to QuickBooks and Xero, and your expenses would be marked as paid automatically within ExpenseTron. So I think with that, we've pretty much come to the end of the webinar. I would like to ask if there are any questions at this point. Any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions that you have. Sure. So I would be sending across a recording to you, Suze. I'd be also sending across an email to you summarizing the contents of what we've discussed. And in case you need further clarifications, you can just hit reply and talk to me. And so we would request you to go ahead and take a look at the ExpenseTron website. So I'm going to send across a link to the website and details about the product. And if you have any questions, feel free to circle back. I'm just an email away. And I want to thank both of you for joining in today's webinar. It's been a great experience interacting with you guys. And feel free to join in other webinars as well. We've got a webinar coming up, which is specifically centered around how HR teams and people operations team can use Slack. So feel free to go ahead and join us for those webinars as well. If there are no questions at this point, then thank you for joining in. Thanks. Bye-bye. Have a great day.